We move on straight into the second one on structure and dynamics of contemporary news ecosystems. It is my great pleasure to introduce the associate editor of IJPP, as well as a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, Sandra Gonzalez-Bailon, who will chair this section. Over to you, Sandra.
Yeah, thanks, Christian. Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me well? All right, cool.
Yes.
So yeah, I'm in charge of the second panel that goes under the title Structure and Dynamics of Contemporary News Ecosystems. We have 3 papers in this panel, and as Christian probably explained a couple of hours before, the deal is every paper has 25 minutes for presentation and discussion, which means that if the authors speak for 12-15 minutes, there will be about 10 minutes for conversation. And if you members of the audience, if you have any questions, you can type it in the chat, and then I can read it back to the authors. And I'm very excited to see what these presentations will illuminate for us. The first paper goes under the title, The Anatomy of European Political Information Environments. It has a dream team of authors. There's many authors in this article. So this is the result, obviously, of a massive collaboration. And Laia, you're gonna be the presenter, am I right? Laia Castro? Are you going to present this paper?
Yes, I'm the presenter.
Oh, there you go. So the floor is yours, and I'll try to send you a private message when you are 15 minutes into the presentation, just so you know how you are doing with timing.
Okay, brilliant. So I will now try to share the screen. Let's see. Okay. Can you see my screen? Yep, okay, wonderful. So welcome all to this presentation of a project that, as Sandra already noted down, is led by a lot of stellar scholars. This is not only a challenging project, but it was a great fun, and I hope you also enjoy the outcomes of this project as much as we did. So the main aim of this project was to provide a detailed description of so-called political information environments in 17 European countries. So by first identifying news user profiles, so ours is a so-called demand-driven approach to the study of political information environments, and second of all, to try to map different news use profiles across Europe to gauge their saliency in different countries. In a third step, we try to investigate how these different information use repertoires add to an informed citizenry, that is how different news use profiles relate to levels of political knowledge, to proxy, somehow their informative value. So why is that important in the first place? We see that media suppliers are under increasing pressures to address the preferences and needs of the audiences, and audiences' preferences are in turn increasingly important predictors of the content that they are exposed to, and perhaps most importantly, the democratic implication of in an increasing mix of news media uses is broadly unknown, and most conspicuously the effects of using different media on political knowledge. So with this aim in mind, we revisited several strands of literature, to start with literature led by some of the co-authors of this project, that posited that political information environments encompass both the supply of news about politics and current affairs, and also the demand for such news and information. As Van Aels argued, a demand-driven approach is all the more needed in high-choice media environments in order to elucidate how effective different media architectures are in making available, conveying, and also ultimately allowing citizens to process and recall relevant political information to make political decisions. So the comparative research that could help us uncovering how effective these media architectures are is so far quite descriptive and focus on the use of different media types, namely TV, newspapers, and different modes of communications or genres, traditional versus social media. So we find, for example, research led by Adam Schiat and Jasper Strombach, accounting for audiences divides across Europe and higher consumption of traditional news media or newspapers reach in Scandinavian countries or Northern European countries as compared to more TV-centric cultures in Southern European countries. We find a recent strand of literature coming from, for example, from the Reuters Institute attesting for audiences divide, so differences or variance country differences when it comes to the use of social media for news as compared to traditional media. In Central and Eastern European countries, for example, we may find that social media for news is more pervasive, since alternative media and also social media are associated to or are believed to be more independent from the government. So bottom line, they find relevant differences across Europe, but again, they focus on particular news consumption patterns. And only recently, more sophisticated country studies have started to delve into this mix of news media uses that I was referring at the beginning, right? So to richer news repertoires, and they have found, for example, minimalists, that is individuals who use only low source, low frequency news media diets, also traditionalists or online only news users. And finally, virtually all research on media effects on political knowledge focuses again on the impact of using certain media types, namely, for example, public service broadcaster. But none of these strands of literature so far take into account the fact that, again, people increasingly mix the use of different media, and that it is the mix that ultimately may matter the most for proxying or for what people might learn. Okay. Of course, we have many theoretical expectations or some expectations from this literature review, but ours is mainly, or by and large, an inductive approach. And hence I won't, list some of our expectations that somehow has been touched upon in the literature review. So I will go directly to our analytical strategy and how we try to make this contribution to previous studies. That is how we measure different mix of users and how we relate that to levels of political knowledge. So we relied on a two-wave panel online survey fielded in 17 European countries on more than 28,000 individuals. We only used the first wave for this study, given that the second wave was launched during the pandemic outbreak and might be quite contact dependent. We then use this data to build news user profiles along theoretically relevant dimensions. We did not only use the frequency with which people use different media types, namely TV, newspapers, radio for news, but we also measure selective exposure, inadvertent news viewing, infotainment, alternative media use. You will see more in the following slides. Then we try to regress these news user profiles that we found against sociodemographic and individual predictors to better profile such news repertoires and find out more about these news users. And finally, we try to connect news users profiles or different news users profiles to levels of so-called surveillance political knowledge. So we design a battery of questions that measure respondents' familiarity with actors, political events, or policy issues that were extensively covered by the news media in the preceding weeks, so to better proxy the contribution of news media diets to knowledge acquisition. So this is the first. This summarizes the first of our results, which is a description of the 5 news user profiles that we find. Details on model fit indicators and robust match checks can be found in the paper. So we came up with these 5 news user profiles along 14 different indicators attesting for these theoretically relevant dimensions that I mentioned at the beginning. And for example, what we can see is that we found a first group of news users, which we tentatively called news minimalists, that represent around 17% of the sample, and that score the lowest in all the dimensions accounted for, except for news avoidance. And then we have also another interesting group, which is a group that it's also to some extent a minimalist in terms of frequency and use of different outlets for news. It's also minimal, but with the difference that they tend to use social media platforms and in greater numbers than the rest of the previous groups. So the traditional and public service, as you can see here, I mean, this group do not score super high, so to speak, in all the dimensions used. So they are, they do not use a lot of media outlets, but instead they focus more on traditional media, namely public service broadcasting, newspapers, radio, and main TV channels, mainstream media. And also use a non-negligible amount of news websites. About the online and selective group, this is a group that, unlike the social media for news group, takes advantage of the internet affordances and use different types of media outlets profusely, and also access directly news websites. And is this encompasses 32% of the sample, so a huge amount of individuals. And finally, we have a smallest group of hyper consumers of news who actually use profusely all sorts of news outlets and score the highest in all the dimensions except for news avoidance. So this is in a nutshell how these 5 different profiles look like. And when we look at different individual predictors of this news user profile, so how when we regress these different news user profiles against individual predispositions and characteristics, we see that our models meet some expectations. So for example, the news minimalist and also the social media for news group scores the lowest in political interest. We also find that social media for news and online and selective users are younger than the average. Traditionalists are, by contrast, older, less confident that the news will find them, highly trustful of the media, and finally, hyper-consumers of news are highly politically interested. So when we zoom in on how salient each of these news profiles are across Europe, we see some interesting patterns. So for example, on average, an individual's predicted probability to belong to the traditionalist group in Germany, Switzerland, or Austria is substantially higher than compared to Southern European countries. And when we look at the patterns of another group of news users who have higher levels of political knowledge than the rest, you will see that in a second. So we see a reverse pattern here, or nearly a reverse pattern, right? So Spaniards, the Greeks, the Italians tend to score the highest for selective and online news users as compared to French or Germans or individuals in some Scandinavian countries. So when we relate these different news user profiles to levels of political knowledge, we also found interesting patterns. So for example, the two user profiles that I just showed tend to perform better than the rest in that they tend to be positively associated to levels of political knowledge. And this is the case regardless of which profile we take as a reference category for traditionalists. So traditionalists are in comparison, most knowledgeable than any other news profile. But also online selective exposure, so that there's some online based, so to speak, news diets that actually are connected to higher levels of knowledge. So again, when we zoom in, and perhaps most interestingly, when we zoom in on differences across countries and how this relationship, what is the contribution of these two news user profiles to levels of political knowledge, we see that, for example, within the traditional media news profile, the relationship with political knowledge tends to be positively associated no matter where, although with some exceptions, Poland and Greece. Sorry. Is there someone speaking, or?
I think someone hasn't unmuted or should unmute.
Okay, so I will go on. Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. So as I was saying, so traditionalists tend to be more knowledgeable than the rest of news users, except in Poland and Greece, where I mean, these also square well with some expectations of blatant political instrumentalization. We saw this in the previous presentation, and low quality of some media outlets that may explain differing patterns. But there's much more variance when it comes to the contribution of these selective and online new user profiles to levels of political knowledge. So here we see much more variance, and we see that, for example, in Scandinavian countries and some small Northern European countries. So this profile may have positive effects on knowledge, whereas in Southern European countries and in Poland, this effect, although with a positive sign, is not significant. So to summarize, this project provides a lot of food for thought, but some of the main highlights would be, for example, that no country is safe from news minimalists. You didn't see that much in the presentation, it's more in the paper, but so far we saw, or we detected, or we found out that actually news minimalists are virtually everywhere an important group, also in line with previous literature. We also found that those who mainly inform through social media, or that use social media for news, tend to be less knowledgeable. This also squares well with previous evidence, consistent with the assumption that sporadically using social media for news and being exposed to disconnected bits of information might not be very or might not add to levels of political knowledge. We nevertheless found that there's a news or an online-based news profile that is positively linked to political knowledge and gathers most of the sample, and also traditionalists, that is people who use traditional media for news, tend to be more knowledgeable. But the bad news is that online-based news use is more pervasive, or tend to be more pervasive in Southern European countries, whereas it is also less informative. Indeed, it seems that it might be more about quality than quantity. So, for example, traditionalists tend to use a lower number of news outlets compared to most of the other profiles, but nevertheless they are more knowledgeable. But hyper-consumer of news tend to be less knowledgeable, and we presume that this might be because of information overload, or also a tendency to news snacking. And I will leave it here. Thank you all for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much, Laia. That was a very interesting paper, a very ambitious project. So congratulations. Let's see. We had a question in the chat by Andre. Let me see if I can find you. See, I had my chat open so that I could find a question quickly, and then when Laia stopped sharing the screen, everything was scrambled, obviously. Okay, Andre, he had a question for slide number 4, and the question is, how do you account for the differences in internet access in the countries that you study.
Okay, let me come back to slide 4. Slide 4 is the data and analytical strategy. So how did I account for differences in the use of internet access? Okay, I understand the question. Well, I actually, this is probably a limitation of the paper, although it's true that, you know, in Europe, these differences in internet access have decreased over the last years, and we may find slight differences. There are differences already. So we find that in some Central and Eastern European countries, you're right. I mean, access to the internet might be around 70 something, 80 something, and these of course may also add to differences and variances across countries. But we use an online sample, meaning that all the users that you know are in our sample are frequent online users, and this probably diminishes, you know, differences across countries in this respect. But of course, it's something that we need to account for in the future.
Great. All right, so Gonzalez-Bailon says, thanks, Laia. You counted the number of outlets that people use. Did you check if there are any associations between news minimalism and specific sources? Or in other words, if you reduce news use, what is the first and what is the last channel to go?
Okay, I'm not sure of having understood the question. So we counted, we basically, okay. So we counted two things here. So we have to count variables. One is the number of media platforms that people use for news, right? And here we have Instagram, we have Facebook, we have Twitter, and then we had another count variable, which is the number of news websites that people access on a weekly basis. And here we had a list of around 17, between 12 and 17 media outlets per country. And these were news websites that were accessed most often. So they are within the top 12, top 17 most accessed news websites in each country. I don't know if this answers your question, or you wanted me to go a bit further or deeper?
If he doesn't answer the question, he can follow up. Then we have one more question by Shelley Boulian, and then and then we probably need to move on to the next paper. So Shelley says, thank you for your presentation. Do you have an example on the types of political knowledge questions where the questions about EU politics?
Yes, actually I have the paper here, and we have a question because there were two waves and we had different questions. So we have one on the new leader of the European Commission. So he asked what her name was. And we also had some questions, but this was for the UK, for example, related to EU politics, like, for example, what was the name that was adopted by a group of MPs that formed a new political party in March 2019, which was the Brexit Party, and these were the two. And then we had another question, but it was a bit more difficult. We had, by the way, different questions with different levels of difficulty on the UK's withdrawal. And the two documents that were within UK's withdrawal, namely the withdrawal agreement and another document. And I think that, yeah, I mean, you can find all the questions in the paper that we uploaded there, and to summarize, we had both international first questions and questions on national politics. For some countries, we had we tried to have to find a balance between questions touching upon latest events, also political actors, or policy issues such as immigration rates. So overall, we are confident that we are touching upon, you know, relevant information that was in the news by the time that that the survey was fielded.
That's great. And I had a question myself, but I'm going to present it, and then maybe you can send me an email, or I can follow up with you by email because we need to move on to the next paper. But my question was about the theoretical justification for the user profiles and whether you have a sense as to how stable they are over time, or whether, you know, it's seasonal. You know, sometimes I'm a minimalist, sometimes. So, you know, that was my question, which I understand is a little bit outside of the scope of the paper. You would need longitudinal data, and it's ambitious enough as it is, but maybe we can talk more about that later. I can send you an email and we can continue the conversation, because
that would be great. Okay.
So the next paper is by Francisco Brandao, and I can't see Francisco. Are you here? If so, identify yourself.
Okay, now I'm a dog here on the picture.
Oh, you're a dog. Okay, that's all right. Well, so I'm going to let the dog speak. Francisco, the paper that Francisco is going to present to us is titled "The Logic of Media-Government Conflict: Finding Equilibrium in News, Press Freedom, and Public Trust." And the floor is yours. There you are.
Thank you so much. Nice meeting you too. So, share. Okay. So, we're all in London time, so good afternoon. This paper started about a year ago when Professor Vakari gave a very inspiring final talk at the last IJPP conference. He invited us to increase our number of observations and try to reach countries that were not represented in the last conference, though we already did have a very large and diversified sample of countries on IJPP 19. So I'm a scholar from the South and from Brazil, a country that's not very well represented in conferences or in journals. So this was for me a call to arms, and I just wish that more scholars follow this vision. So if we have to talk about a new problem in political communication, which is affecting many countries, I want to talk about the increasing hostility against the media. In the last decade, press freedom has been deteriorating all over the world, and not only in autocracies, but also in democracies. And those are the countries on the map. You see, our world is becoming much more bloodier and darker for journalists. It's harder for journalists not only to work, but to be. So there are many factors explaining this trend. One of them is the rise of populist leaders. So we are very used to them in Latin America. But my question is not what's causing hostility against the media. My question is how journalists should strategically respond to increasingly hostile governments. So let's start with the model. First of all, I will assume that journalists and politicians are rational, self-interested individuals who want to further their own careers. For that, they both want to maximize public trust. Journalists want to write trustworthy stories about the government to get more audience, advertisement, reputation, a better paycheck, a better job. And politicians are used in the news stories to have more prestige and power, mobilize people, resources, implement public policies. Journalists also compete with each other, and politicians also use journalists in contests with other politicians inside or outside the government. So both journalists and politicians are competing for the same limited resource, which is public trust. The paradigm to analyze conflicts like this is the hawk-dove game. In this game, each player can use conventional or modern tactics to fight for public goods. A journalist can play dove by publishing good news, or play hawk by publishing bad news. On her turn, a public official can play Dove, offering positive incentives for the press as an exclusive interview. Or the government can play hawk, and they can be very creative on hawk tactics, from refusing to answer a question, calling names, up to prisons, exile, killings. In the game, if a Dove journalist meets a Dove public official, they will just share the gains on public trust. If Dove meets hawk, then most or all of the resources go to hawk, and Dove is left with nothing or just a small utility on public trust. If hawk meets hawk, then there's a cost of injuries, which reduce the values that will be shared between them. So the news value in the contest between the press and politicians depends on the level of trust in media and trust in government. The public tends to receive and accept information that reinforces their attitudes. So considering this, the probability is that if public trusts government for bad news, there's a value of VI equals 1. And for good news, VI equals 2. If the public distrusts government, it's the opposite. Now, if public distrusts media, there is a value of VJ equals 1. If trust in media, VJ equals 2. A news value, V, equals VI plus VJ. So there will be very different news values and very different payoffs to media and government according to public trust in media and in government. However, there are different Nash equilibria in each scenario. In this slide, you find Nash equilibria when there's a pair of best replies in the same strategy. Best replies are colored in yellow, and media payoffs are underlined. Arrows point to dominant strategies. So then, with public trust both in media and government, there are two Nash equilibria. So publish good news if negative incentives, or publish bad news if positive incentives. On scenario 2, there's distrust both in media and government, and there is only one Nash equilibrium, publish bad news with positive incentives. On scenario 3, with public trust in media and distrust in government, there is no Nash equilibrium. On scenario 4, where public distrusts media and trusts government, there is one Nash equilibrium in good news with negative incentives. Now let's imagine that we are increasing hostility in our model by making hawks more resistant to injuries. In a society, this could happen if people become more tolerant to threats and abuses against journalists, or public officials' reputation is not much damaged by bad news. In other words, they could murder someone on a very busy street and still get away with it. In this case, I will assign, instead of C equals 2, C equals 1. And the consequences are significant. On the first scenario, where there is trust in media and government, we lose Nash equilibria. In the previous slide, there were 2. Now there's none. And the dominant strategy for the media flips from good news to bad news. Scenario 2, with distrust in media and in government, we lose Nash equilibrium in bad news with positive incentives. And now we have a new Nash equilibrium. Bad news if negative incentives, which means the game gets much more dangerous. Scenario 3, media trust and government distrust. We didn't have a Nash equilibrium before. Now there is a Nash equilibrium in bad news if negative incentives. Again, I feel for the press in this situation. Scenario 4, with media distrust and government trust, it's pretty much the same as it was before. Nash equilibrium remains in good news with negative incentives. Summing up, when hostility goes high, media should go low and use bad news if there is distrust in government. So in a society, there can be journalists who only publish good news, journalists who only publish bad news, and others who sometimes play hawk and sometimes play dove. On systemic level, there will be an evolutionary stable strategy, while the media uses mixed strategy of both bad news and good news in a certain proportion, which is optimal for that society. This also requires that journalists are competitive between them. Simply put, the payoff to media competition is greater then the utility of the government when attacks the press. If those are equal, then the utility of media attacks against the government should be greater than the government competition. I tested the model with a sample of 49 countries and 2 territories that were selected based on wave 6 and 7 from World's Best Surveys. So I collected 55,000 news stories from about 3,300 publishers through Google News and detected bad news with sentiment analysis by NRC. So data still have cooked. I didn't produce any good looking graphics, but most of all, you can see in the first of the models that we do find some significant on share of the population trusting in the press and trusting in the government to predict bad news. Press freedom is not variable. Maybe it's not a good measure because it only measures negative incentives and not positive incentives. But the model kind of gives a clue that we are in the right direction. On the bottom, we have a new model, and I controlled bad news with GDP growth. And while GDP growth is not significant as a predictor for bad news, trust in the government remains significant. Trust in the press, not anymore. I said predict bad news, but it's actually predicting positive news. Sorry. So in the right side, there are other 2 models, and we lose the intercept with them, but trust with the press and trust, government trust, they remain significant, or almost significant, right? Well, so what are the conclusions? So every model is a simplification of reality, and media government conflicts are much more complex than the media gimmick theory I built here. There could be many other strategies used by politicians and journalists as conditional strategies, symbolic threats, symbolic violence. I talk a little bit more about them on the paper. Here I only talked about hawks and doves, but there are much more animals fighting in the wild world of political communication. Myron Smith, that was the creator of and Price that created this hawk-dove gimmick theory, they say that sometimes the threat displays of some species to have an appearance of maniacal fury. Hence, there is probably some advantage in acting this way. You can imagine some politicians acting like this, in this maniacal fury. The thing is, we need more models and more research about conflicts between media and government. And I left some suggestions on the paper. As a conclusion, I want to invite you to a mutation in media theories, to become less normative and more strategic. Simply put, to build more appropriate models for an increasingly hostile environment. To solve collective action problems, finding non-violent solutions for conflicts is the main purpose of politics. But if we follow this research agenda, we will also be fighting for the conservation and from the survival of the press. And that's my conclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francisco. That was great. There's no questions in the chat right now, so I'm going to ask my question. And in the meantime, if any person in the audience wants to type their question in the chat, you can also raise your virtual hand, and then I can see you in the participants list. But so, Francisco, this last statement you made that research and media should be less normative and more strategic, which follows your game theoretic approach. But what would be the lessons that we learn from this strategic approach in terms of designing interventions in the context of your paper to alleviate conflict? Or maybe we don't want to alleviate conflict. I mean, what would be the practical implications, and how can we learn strategies to change the dynamics that we observe right now?
So the thing is, this model, it doesn't invalidate all the research we do of journalism as a culture, right? What's culture? Culture is nothing but the natural selection of many strategies that are played from time to time, on and on, every news cycle between journalists and politicians. So they're playing strategies against each other again and again and again, and they are selecting the best ones to follow the game. So this is culture, right? But the problem is that sometimes we are too involved on norms, traditions, and we forget that sometimes we have to act more strategically, especially in a situation like this, and when you have to respond to this increasingly hostile environment.
Great, thanks.
And just an observation, I only take questions from doves, okay?
Yeah.
No hogs.
Unfortunately, you don't have a say about now. So I think, yeah, most audience members are doves. And we have two questions. So Yanya asks, first she says very interesting analysis. And so is all the data collected secondary, or did you collect some first-hand information?
So I'm using word value survey for my main variables. They are trust in media and trust in government. So because of that, I sampled data only from countries that were on the word value survey, right? And the data I used and I collected was from news stories collected through Google News. So each country I collected about 100 stories about the government that were quoting the head of government every month in the same year that there was a word value survey. So this came to about 55,000 news stories, because in some countries you have 2 languages and I had to collect stories about both of those languages. And this gives another interesting observations, like in some countries, one language is more negative than the other language. Like they write more bad news about the government than the native language, I suppose. The colonial language, or the language that was acquired by, it's more international, perhaps, I don't know. There must be some kind of explanation.
Right. Inke writes, fascinating approach, thank you. How did you define dove and hawk with 49 countries? Did you include, with the 49 countries you included, are dove and hawk strategies the same, I'm assuming, across countries?
Yeah, that's the problem. Like for government, we don't have a data set with positive incentives, right? I'm just using press freedom. Press freedom, I don't know, maybe some of the questions they do talk about clientelism or some other tactics that are not that dangerous, but I think it's mainly measuring dangerous tactics, it's mainly measuring hawks. So I think that's why it performed so bad. For the press, it's just good news and bad news. Like I collected the news stories through Google News, and then I run sentiment analysis to see if in each country you have more hawks or more doves as journalists. What's the proportion of journalist hawks and journalist doves?
And I'm assuming more details are in the paper, all the technical details. Is the paper available?
Yeah, I just posted this afternoon.
All right.
I'm so sorry, guys, but the data is half cooked, and I didn't put the findings in the paper yet. I will work on that more. I will rush more, but it's mainly the theory there, mainly the theoretical parts, and it's pretty big already. I think I got very enthusiastic on the theoretical part.
All right, so I think, let's see, maybe we have time for one more question, but if not, this will be the last. Vanessa says, hi, Francisco, what a great presentation, obrigada. I wonder if you could talk more about the value of journalists' competition within a hostile environment. I'm looking at the opposite cooperation. So it seems like you two have some stuff to talk about, but so yeah.
I don't know if you're from Brazil, Vanessa, but I think you got the inside joke I put on this slide, right? Sorry, I just forgot. What's the question again?
Yeah, so the question is whether you could talk, she wonders whether you could talk more about the value of journalists' competition in a hostile environment.
Yeah, so we should be more strategic. It will depend on the country, right? Sometimes we have these norms and these strategies like fairness, objectivity, and they might be valuable in some societies that have competitive two-party system and people are pretty much 50% likely to believe and trust in the government, right? But in other societies, that's not the case. This is fairness and objectivity is nothing but a mixed strategy. Like mixed strategy is kind of a hybrid of hawk and dove. But instead of being played through time, it's being atomized and put in the same news story. So that's what happens. Like if you chain yourself to these traditions and just follow the norms, you lose. Like sometimes you can gain more trust from the public if you'll be bad or if you'll be nice too. So it depends on the situation, how much the public trusts you, who is the public you are reaching, right? And that's the strategy. And we need more theory and more research on that. So please, if you are interested, we could talk later and maybe do some collaborative work, right?
Yeah.
I think we're both from Brazil, I don't know.
And yeah, and we are definitely sympathetic to the notion that more research is needed on a global scale and comparatively. So, and by the way, Vanessa says, deal, yes, I'm in. Okay, so good. But before we move on, Christian wants to know what is the inside joke on this slide. We won't be able to tell us, so you have to tell us.
So yeah, like we have a populist president in Brazil, like new style, he goes on Facebook every Thursday. And on social media, his followers are called cattle. So when I read Maynard Smith and Price talk about the cattle that does this threat displays and has the maniacal fury against the press, talks too much, but it's not a good fighter. It's some kind of clumsy because he has big horns, but most stomps and goes from a very distance talking to the journalists and can't do much harm.
All right.
I hope you find it funny.
Yeah, Christian, let us know if you are satisfied with this explanation. I guess he is. But anyway, we have to move on. Francisco, thank you very much for the very interesting talk.
Thank you much. I'm looking forward to any collaboration or... Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, we are moving to the third paper of the panel by Matthias Ekman and Andreas Whitholm, who I see on my screen. So the title of the paper is Imitating the News, Political Communication, Parasitic News Formats, and the Decline of Journalistic Activity, Authority. And the floor is yours. So please let us know about your very interesting research.
Thank you so much. Can you hear us? Thank you. So, thank you so much. We would like to start by just saying something about the concept of parasitic news, which we focus on here. So, what is parasitic news? What do we mean by this specific term? We argue that parasitic news can be seen as a specific trajectory of mediatized politics. It is related to the constant broadening of politicians' communicative repertoire as they adapt to an increasingly digital and social media ecosystem. More specifically, parasitic news manifests itself in an increased use of journalistic conventions, practices and genres in political communication to get attention and spreadability online. When politicians communicate in the form of parasitic news, they switch sides and position themselves as journalists or reporters. They imitate news for political purposes, so to speak. Parasitic news can also be understood as a way of exploiting the credibility and trustworthiness of journalism for political purposes. In some cases, it's also a way of exploiting a growing public distrust towards the media through production of so-called alternative news. However, we make a distinction between alternative media, which usually is connected to actors positioned outside the political system, and parasitic news, which we see as something which is produced by actors inside the political system. So, we draw on 3 strands of research in the analysis of parasitic news in this paper. First of all, boundary work and journalistic authority relating to the constant discursive struggle over what journalism is and what counts as news. And also how journalism's authority is challenged by new actors, for example, some of the politicians we study here. Secondly, we draw on previous work on so-called alternative media. Particularly important here is the notion that alternative media is something that stands in opposition to the mainstream media, but also in opposition sometimes to the political establishment in a country, such as Sweden, which is the case here. A third strand of research is the increasing number of studies on fake news. Just like fake news, parasitic news try to imitate news in terms of form. As we will show, the goal of parasitic news is not necessarily to mislead viewers, however. Instead, it's related to a broader struggle of attention online among political actors and parties. It's also related to a popularization of political discourse. So, in terms of research design, we assess our material through 7 analytical dimensions. Relationship with legacy media, that is, if they are in opposition to mainstream media or not, for example. We look at genres, we look at platform affordances, we look at level of professionalism, that is the extent to which the content tends to have a sense of amateurism, or if it appears to be professionally produced. We look at ideological position as well as ideological transparency in the content. And we also look at differences between news produced by individual politicians versus news produced by a broader group of people as a collective practice.
Yes, and moving along to the first case. The first case features 2 alternative news sites called Samhällsnytt and Exakt 24. They are run by former members of parliament, including high-position politicians from the right-wing populist party, the Sweden Democrats. But here they have transformed into news reporters, journalists, and publishers, as we can see here in the images displayed. While no longer active politicians at the national level, one of the MP, the one that we see here, financed the predecessor to one of these outlets when he served as the spokesperson on legal policies in the parliament. The 2 sites are alternative or self-referenced correctives to politically correct media or Lügenpresse, the idea that legacy media and particularly public service in the Swedish case are concealing the truth from citizens, and that these news sites provide uncensored news that legacy media doesn't cover in their daily news feeds. They build on 2 practices. They recontextualize online news, and they build news around user-generated content, primarily images and videos circulating on social media sites, but also provided to these sites. This results in a sort of tabloid style news featured by sensationalism and also taboo-breaking style news, for example, including footage and images of violence or other graphic footage which generates data traffic to their sites. Often these violent images also include then pictures of immigrants as perpetrators. These news sites are ostensibly professional. We define them as semi-professional since they involve people with a background in legacy news journalism. And as for political discourse, they provide content with a highly politicized form of news value. So basically, what we see here is right-wing populist politics in the form of news. Our second case is completely different. It features a talk show host called Snack med Sjöstedt. Here, the party leader of the left party has switched sides. He's hosting his own talk show and interviews invited, often prominent guests. The guests are mainly from the field of culture and known to the public in Sweden. The show is recorded live from a public venue, often a pub or a restaurant or a theater stage, as in this case, with a live audience, and it's aired live on Facebook and on the party's website. It draws on a popular talk show format, which is popularized in the intersection between factual television and entertainment. So there is a political discourse going on here, but in a very personalized form, featured in the interviews that the party leader has with his guests. There is no particular connection to legacy media here, but the show is mainly a way of promoting the left party online using an unusual format for the party leader. The production is sort of amateurish or low budget and centered on the party leader, not on the party politics or policies. So politics come to the fore in more personalized ways through conversation with invited guests. And Sjöstedt and the left party also capitalizes on its relatively high popularity among culture actors. There are really, really sort of highbrow guests in this program. Our third case is the newspaper Nyheter i Västerbotten. It's produced by the Moderate Party in the region of West Bothnia. The Moderate Party is the second largest party in Sweden, a liberal conservative party, former party in government. This newspaper was launched as an alternative to regional legacy media, mainly public service, and the main broadsheet in the region, Västerbotten-Kuriren. It has an official publisher, which is an MP for the Moderate Party. The news on this newspaper resembles regional or local broadsheet news. The format and style are conventional news articles, and they are generally framed seemingly neutral or professional on political issues and affairs in the region. But the news, when you look at them, is basically promoting the activities, policies, and politicians of the Moderate Party. And you can call them press releases, basically, in the style and format of news. The newspaper is semi-professional, and it builds mainly on desk work made by some people hired by the Moderate Party. And at first, there were no transparency, there were no connection made between this newspaper and the party. But after being publicly criticized by other media and also by scholars and other journalists, they attached a smaller disclaimer on the site explaining that it's part of the Moderate Party, but it's quite hard to find it on the website.
Okay, our fourth case is God Ton, a podcast hosted by one of Sweden's most influential politicians online, Hanif Bali. Hanif Bali is an MP for the conservative Moderate Party in Sweden. He is known to be highly controversial. He's often accused for using a racist and populist language in social media. And he's producing this podcast together with Per Lindgren. God Ton can be understood as oppositional and corrective when it comes to the relationship with mainstream media. The podcast focuses on issues such as migration, gender, and the environment, and always from a critical and conservative point of view, where the target is either the current Swedish government, the Social Democrats, together with the Green Party, or the mainstream media, which is often criticized. The language is humoristic and provocative. Journalists are often referred to as migration activists, for example. Criminals are described as trash or ghetto warriors and stuff like that. So God Ton capitalized primarily on the interview genre. It contains invited guests such as comedians, authors, academics, and experts. And they are carefully selected in the sense that they tend to promote conservative values through this podcast and in the discussion. So God Tone is ideologically transparent, and it does not claim to produce objective news in any sense. It is also a good example of individual parasitic news practices. Bali's position in the podcast often breaks with the broader policies of the moderate party, which he represents in the parliament. And our last case is 2022, a news talk show hosted by the two representatives of the Green Party in Sweden. Alice Bah Kuhnke and Per Holmgren, which you can see in the image to the right, are current members of the European Parliament. And Alice Bah Kuhnke is also the former Minister of Culture in Sweden. What is specific about this case is also that both Bah Kuhnke and Holmgren have a professional background from the television industry. Bah Kuhnke hosted several primetime television shows in public service as well as in commercial TV. And Holmgren was a weather presenter for more than 10 years in public service television. So these are very known people from the media in Sweden, and now they have gone to politics instead. Both of them capitalize on their status as former journalists, and the content is not critical in any sense of mainstream media. On the contrary, this is a program that seeks to compete with alternative far-right media online, which Matthes talked about. So the program draws on traditional TV news genres, such as interviews, and it even features a weather segment where Holmgren acts as a traditional weather presenter with a focus on global climate problems. It's professional, but also ideologically transparent, thus a good example of individual rather than collective forms of parasitic news.
Okay, to conclude then, we argue that parasitic news has two main dimensions as displayed in our material. On the one hand, parasitic news could be understood as alternative media or alternative news, where political discourse is intentionally embedded in the format and style of news journalism. This results in a highly politicized news and could best be understood as a self-reference corrective to legacy media. This is the predominant feature of far-right and right-wing populist news media outlets, but in our case it is also partly visible in the regional branch of the moderate party in the Nyheter i Västerbotten case. On the other hand, we see parasitic news as a political communication style where politicians and political actors borrow formats, genres, and practices of news journalism in order to make political discourse more accessible, more appealing, and to increase its spreadability in the online ecology. This is often made through personalization, where communication is centered on the specific politician, as in the case of the talk show and the podcast, but also through connectivity with other famous or important persons, such as the guests in the talk show and the podcast. In the former dimension, the dimension of alternative news, the political discourse is more implicit and sometimes even concealed and hidden behind a sort of ostensibility, objectivity, or professionalism. In the latter, political discourse is explicit and therefore transparent. Politics is centered on the performance of the individual politicians, such as in the talk shows, for example. We argue that the right-wing construction of alternativeness takes place in an online struggle over credibility and legitimacy related to the boundaries of news and journalism. In other words, they try to capitalize on the credibility of news journalism in the vast flow of online information where source scrutinizing and fact-checking are increasingly harder to account for. The center-left-wing alternativeness is constructed in opposition to the right-wing alternative media and as a way of gaining attention online. So finally, to sum up, parasitic news has the potential to further contribute to the decline of journalistic authority is our argument here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Matthes and Andreas. That was very interesting. Do we have any questions Nikki Asher left a comment more than a question in the chat, and I would say that that you can also add comments in the chat, not only questions. But I don't know if you want to come live, Nikki, and tell us about the motivation of your comment, or should I just read it? She was right. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm actually, I've been so hooked on, I'm about to teach and I kept this going. But it seems like there's a lot of good comparative potential. I think just like if you look at, Glenn Beck, Bill Moyers in the US, and sadly you guys know those names better than I know the names and I am sorry about that. But it also seems like you're getting at, like with that boundary works, at the very definition between what is political communication and journalism, and what's that slippage doesn't matter. So I guess that's the question, like, is that the rich theoretical line worth going for, or is that just like a boring side note? I don't know. Here's my voice thing.
Thanks, and good luck with the teaching. Thank you for being tuned in, even though you're about to teach. I'm impressed. So Andreas, Matthias, did you understand the question? Do you want me to repeat it? I don't know if the sound was very good. What is the difference between political communication and journalism?
That's a good question. I mean, we've been sort of struggling with understanding this either as just new forms of political communication, obviously, but since they draw so much of sort of conventions within journalism, professional journalism, and this switching side of identities is also interesting, that you have politicians coming in from politics, from the media sector, and then acting out their sort of former professional identities as politicians. On the one hand, for example, with the Green Party, or in the other case where you have former high-ranked members of parliament and high-ranked politicians within Swedish Democrats becoming news reporters, acting out their new professional roles, even though they're still attached to their former party. So we have been struggling with where is the sort of theoretical and analytical potential of defining this either as boundary struggles or sort of boundary shifting within journalism and or political communication, or if you should just see this as a new form of sort of adapting a journalistic style of political communication. But I think that for the audience, for citizens, it becomes very confusing when you have news-styled political communication flowing through your everyday sort of information flow, and it looks like news, and it's spread like news. We have some examples in the paper where news, for example, in the third case, with the regional newspaper, who has been picked up by Russia Today, for example, and made it a huge sort of local scandal in the region where a school principal were slammed by Russia Today for several reasons. So there is a problem here of defining the boundaries, I think, between political communication on the one hand and journalism on the other hand.
Great, thanks. So Christian asks, how relevant are social media in generating traffic and credibility for these outlets, given that there are fewer source quality cues on social media? Is it easier for these parasitic formats to get traction and be seen as credible on social media?
Well, in all these cases, social media is extremely important. So it differs depending on what type of parasitic news we're talking about. But if we take the Green Party, for example, it's mainly distributed via Bakunke's Instagram account and her activities in social media, because it's such an individualistic, it's focused on individuals. So it's very, very important there. And she's also, I mean, huge in social media. So it's very important. In terms of the podcast, for example, Hanif Bali, is I mean, a very controversial political figure in Sweden, but he's also very, very influential. So in his case, the podcast can actually be seen as an extension of the activities that he is producing on Twitter, for example. He's actually more influential on Twitter than the entire party that he is representing. So he's very, very important for the party as well, although he is controversial within his own party as well, because the podcast, as well as his own views, often breaks with the broader policies of the party. So yeah, you want to add something, Matthes?
No.
All right, so we have 2 more questions. Let's see if we can fit them in. So Imke Henkel mischievously asks, couldn't you make the argument the other way around, that politicians adopt journalistic forms to assume the authority of journalists? I'm sorry, I think I'm doing a really bad job at reading the question. Did you try to measure credibility of politicians' parasitic use versus authentic journalist use? So that's one question. And if you allow me, just keep it in your RAM memory. I'm going to read the other question because we're running out of time. But Ivor Gaber asks, it's more like a comment, but it says, interesting paper, but in the UK, a number of politicians, including Nigel Farage, have gone on to become shock jocks, talk show hosts, etc., but not as journalists per se, so that's more of a comment. And then finally, what are the empirical indicators to draw the boundaries between parasitic news and news from the alternative media? So how about you deal with those questions? And then if Christian doesn't shut me out, then sort of shut me down, let's see, there's one more question. But so, so do you want to address these two questions?
Yeah, we haven't measured credibility in terms of this paper. I mean, it would be interesting. I think that in order to find out the sort of impact of these cases, audience studies would be very relevant here. And as for the second question, no, we don't argue that they have become journalists per se. It's not the point. The point is the sort of borrowing and the parasitic ways that they feed off journalism's authority in their political communication practices then. So it's not so much that they are journalists in a traditional sense, but that they are borrowing the credibility of journalism, the institutional credibility, in order to increase credibility and so forth in the online domain. And I think there's been some studies here in Sweden where there's been where they have been measuring sort of news that comes from credible news journalistic sources and those who don't. And it turns out that it could be very hard for audiences or citizens to actually find out, to have sort of proper source scrutination and fact-checking behind material. So this is a way of also sort of confusing the roles within the sort of larger online ecology, if you so will. To add to this sort of boundary struggle, not claiming to be journalists, of course. The final question, I don't remember that.
Yeah, so we're reaching the stage where we are like, Christian might tell me to shut it down. Christian, how are we doing?
We have time for one more if you think there is one.
All right, so I mean, and please, feel free to also read the questions when you're done with the presentation in the chat, and so maybe you can also engage in conversation with those, because I'm not sure I'm doing a fair job at reading these questions. The last comment left in the chat refers to Manuel Castell's work on media power and politics, and so the question is, how do you think that the media can extricate themselves from the strange hold of politicians and power holders? That's a big question, but so, you know, do you have any answer to that?
A very difficult question to answer. Well, I saw that someone mentioned Nigel Farage here. If I actually prefer to answer that question, because Nigel Farage was actually a guest in one of the shows here on the Green Party, and he was discussing the Brexit issue. And I just want to emphasize the fact that, I mean, the idea that we can see political communication as something different from journalism. In this case, Nigel Farage was actually interviewed from a subjective point of view, of course, since it was the Green Party's representatives who was doing the interview. But both of them, I mean, it was sort of a hybrid approach in the sense that they actually are former journalists who have become politicians, and now they sort of oscillate between the position of journalists and politicians. And for viewers and users of social media, as Matthes said, it's very difficult to tell which position are they in right now. So capitalizing on the whole idea of journalism has obviously become so much more prominent in political communication, in Sweden at least.
Yeah. Well, I think it's pretty obvious that the conversation is not finished. There's other comments and questions coming in the chat. So I encourage you all to continue this conversation.
Yeah.
And I think
we should emphasize that this is work in progress as well. So thanks for all the comments.
Sure. No, it was a pleasure to hear what